Priorities Committee meeting. I'd like to first recognize that we are on the traditional territory of the Nanaimo First Nations. I would also like to take this time to recognize that we are wearing our orange shirts today, and the city of Nanaimo honors the memory of the former Kamloops residential school children. In recognition of the lives of 215 children who lost their lives at the former residential school in Kamloops, the mayor has asked that the city of Nanaimo facilities lower flags to half staff. We stand united in grief with our Indigenous friends and neighbors all across the country to honor the lives of those children, their families, survivors, and all children who never made it home from this dark chapter of our history. The Canadian and City of Nanaimo flags on city properties throughout the community, including the gateways, will be lowered to half-mast and will remain down for the rest of the week. So, our clerk today is Ms. Sheila Gurry. Today's Governance and Priorities Committee's meeting will be held in accordance with the Community Charter, Council Procedure Bylaw 2018 number 7272, and Ministerial Order number M192 governing open meetings during a state of emergency, and the Provincial Health Officer Order regarding gatherings and events. Therefore, as members of the public cannot attend in person, they are required to observe meetings virtually, and question period will be suspended throughout the duration of the provincial health orders in effect. So first, we will have any introduction of late items. Ms. Gurry.
Thank you, Chair. There are no late items for today's meeting.
Thank you. So I'll have a motion for the adoption of the agenda. So move, Mayor Krog, Councillor Hemmons, all those in favor? Thank you, motion passes. Motion for adoption of the minutes as circulated. I'm trusting no errors and omissions. Moved by Councillor Hemmons, seconded by Mayor Krog, all those in favor? Any opposed? Motion passes. So first on the agenda, to be introduced by Sheila Gurry, is our Governance and Priorities Committee agenda planning. Ms. Gurry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For this Governance and Priorities Committee meeting, starting on page 14 of your agenda, shows the calendar of Governance and Priorities Committee meetings for 2021. And of note, after today's meeting, there will be 9 left for the remainder of the year. Starting on page 17 is the GPC matrix that lists Council's priority items that staff will endeavor to have completed during the remaining 9 meetings of this year, as well as additional items that have been added but not rated yet, have also been populated in this matrix. And the Governance and Priorities Committee members will have an opportunity late June or the first meeting in July to see if your priorities are still how they're ranked now, or if there's been changes, or if additional items need to be added into those priority ranked items. So unless there is any questions and or additions, that is it for the agenda planning for this meeting.
Okay, I don't see anybody with a hand raised. So thank you for that information. And we'll move on to the next item. First, before I do that, I do want to let everybody know that Don Bonner and Councillor Don Bonner and Councillor Cheryl Armstrong are both attending the federal conference, and so are unable to attend today and send their regrets. The next item on the agenda will be introduced by Mr. Sims, and it's to provide council with an update on overall mobility planning and policy development as we embark on phase 2 of Reimagine Nanaimo and sparked discussion to help guide the next steps of the Reimagine Nanaimo process. And just wondering for this morning, Mr. Sims, what the process might be for today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is the information report you have in front of you is really a two-stage process. There's a fairly lengthy presentation, but that both Mr. Rose and our consultant, Mr. Davidson, will be presenting to Council, but it's really, again, intended to spark discussion on the part of all Council members. So it's really about, as we move through Reimagine, and it's a wonderfully coherent process that not only we're bringing land use and mobility and Parks and Rec all together, as well as economic development and the other plans that are associated, but it's really building it together with the active transportation master plan, which has grown out of the Nanaimo transportation plan. So this will help provide direction for the future. I suppose it's with the previous engagement that we've had through Reimagine Nanaimo Phase 1, we've seen lots of support and demand on the part of the public for active transportation and improved mobility, and that's really helping to steer the next steps. So the on your GPC planning agenda, there is the item of crosswalk safety, and I think today's presentation really helps provide some context and provide some background information for Council to consider, and then before we do that, more detailed look at crosswalk safety. So I think the timing is good. And then this afternoon, of course, is the workshop on Reimagine scenarios, which this will also help set some of that context. So without any further ado, I'll pass it over to Mr. Rose, and I'll duck out of the way and enjoy. I think the situation is that you would ask questions as you go. I think this is really intended to be a dialogue. So I hope that helps, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. As Mr. Sims indicated, we are here to provide some updates on what we've learned through Phase 1 of Reimagine through the lens of mobility, and to share that information and provide some insight as we progress into the conversations of land use scenario planning for this afternoon. This really is envisioned as being as much of a conversation as a presentation today. We're really hopeful that we can engage you and provide you with information and answer questions and facilitate a dialogue that will be a good springboard for this afternoon. So starting off through Phase 1, actually, sorry, I just realized the slide deck's not actually running. Thank you. Thank you very much. Through Phase 1, we have gathered a great deal of information. Sorry, can we move to the next slide? Thank you. So we've progressed through Phase 1 and we're currently in Phase 2. We're going to be having the land use workshop this afternoon. But before we get into that, like I said, I do want to step back and discuss how we got here and what we've learned. And then lay out sort of the chronology of what we will do in Phase 2. As Mr. Sims said, we will be doing a deep dive on the pedestrian mobility aspects. We'll also be doing a integrated workshop with transit. That's the RDN and BC Transit have the redevelopment strategy underway, and we will need to merge the land use planning, the active transportation planning, and the transit as those two processes come together. And then outline Phase 3 expectations, and that's where we actually start to get into the implementation strategies and the discussions, and I think the phrase I've heard before is bringing it all together. So next slide, please. So the Reimagine process is a very holistic approach. It's not just a OCP, it's not an active transportation plan, it's not just a Parks and Rec plan. It is a overarching discussion to gain an understanding of what the community is aspiring to, and looking back to understand what we've done already to get to where we are. And so as part of this, we've started by looking back at our parks plan, OCP, transportation plan, and then looked beyond our own borders into the transit redevelopment strategy and other plans that are associated with the Ministry of Transportation and any other of our partner agencies that feed into mobility planning. We have also engaged the public to validate all of the information we already have. And as Mr. Sims indicated, we've got a very strong appetite for more and better active transportation planning. This has been thematic from Reimagine back to our Complete Streets plans to some of our more focused downtown mobility study and Nanaimo Regional Hospital area plan. In order to achieve success through Reimagine, it is imperative that we work with all of our partner agencies to ensure that we all understand what each other is needing and what the community is asking of us, and mesh all of these tasks to develop an overall plan. With transit, we have the redevelopment strategies underway. We've also been working with the Ministry of Transportation as they're doing some reviews on their system in the area. And so it's important to understand that they have similar needs to ours, but we do have an interface where there may be some, we may need to become a bit more creative to align land use with our mobility planning. Can I see the next slide, please? Thank you. As part of the information gathering, we went back and reviewed the goals and visions through the transportation master plan. And through that, we found that without question, the visions and goals still resonated with the community through the public engagement we've had so far. Safety is a primary objective. Mobility, connectivity, and sustainability are also very high priorities with well-established goals. And accessibility and affordability are also paramount in developing the plans for our mobility, our active transportation plan, and our mobility planning. Unfortunately, one thing we also discovered through this was that the goal of generating greater mode shifts has not really, we've not really seen any change since 2006. And so that's something that we felt we should retain the goals of, but just review how we're anticipating trying to affect that change. Next slide, please. As I noted, many of our mobility plans involve partnerships with other agencies. For transit, we're working to ensure that the redevelop. I'm sorry. Oh,
sorry, Chair. I'd raised my yellow hand, if I may.
Sorry. Yes.
Thanks very much. Mr. Rose, much appreciate this so far. So I take it what you're telling us in terms of this type of trips being undertaken by people in Nanaimo, are you saying neither transit nor bicycle nor pedestrian nor vehicular transport has changed substantially since 2006? Am I?
That's correct. The split between walking, biking, transit, and personal vehicles has remained almost unchanged. Now, I think that it's important to acknowledge that that up until probably the last 3 years, our investments in walking and biking have been slightly more modest, but unfortunately, we haven't seen a great deal of change. But with the 2021 census and the information that comes from that, I'm quite hopeful that we will see something more significant.
And if I may, Chair,
Yes.
through you, when do you anticipate receiving that information? Do you have any idea?
I would say late next year at the earliest. Unfortunately, it won't be in time to inform this process.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate
Thank you.
So with through the lens of transit, we're partnering with the RDN and BC Transit on their redevelopment strategy. Now we do acknowledge that that is more of a 5-year vision as opposed to the longer term vision that Reimagine has. But that will also set the foundation for the frequent and rapid bus systems within the city. That process has not progressed quite as quickly or as far as the Reimagine process, but we have been working with our partners to share the information gathered through Reimagine to sort of help give them to provide a head start or a boost to get the process caught up with where Reimagine is. One of the most interesting pieces of information I found through that we found through Reimagine was the relationship between transit service and our mapping of household incomes. And I found that this really sort of tied back to the principles within the donut model, and it's not just isolated to transit. It's actually quite thematic across our walking, biking, and transit system. But it was quite interesting to see that the areas that have the longest walk and wait times for transit service are actually quite closely aligned with our lower income areas. And so it does sort of identify the question of how can we provide a service to areas that may be the most in need of having affordable and accessible transportation, and does that possibly create a conflict with a resource application for or investment for areas that are already have higher ridership that could benefit from more investment to generate greater ridership. So it's something that we'll have to look at through the land use scenarios and through the transit redevelopment strategy. But it is something that it really caught my eye as we were looking at this information.
Chair, could I ask a question?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you can see hands, so I just jumped in. So, Mr. Rose, I just want to make sure I have that correct. Our neighborhoods, our communities with generally a lower socioeconomic status have higher, lower rates of transit and walkability. And your thinking on that is that we want to look at a return on investment where we potentially invest more in those neighborhoods to get people walking or cycling, but that there's also a flip side in that in the neighborhoods that are already, let's say, use cycling, are cycling more. Do we put more infrastructure in to try to encourage more cycling where it's already happening? Do I have that accurate? That
is the potential tug of war between resources, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so so as I indicated, this is still fairly early days with the Reimagine study. I believe that they're embarking on their engagement phase starting tomorrow, I think, and will go for a month. And then once that process and the background information has been gathered through that, we will be coming back for a collaborative discussion, which will take the land use scenarios and align them with the information being gathered on that front. And we'll have to explore some of the options and plan for the implementation strategies later on. Next slide, please. So cycling is a pretty appealing mode of transportation in Nanaimo. We have the weather and the natural ability to allow people to cycle year round. And we've got through phase 1 and through our information gathering, we were able to utilize some new technology. We've talked about this in the past to gain a very strong understanding of where our highest usage is right now and relate that to some of the gaps that we see in the various corridors and identify where we've got sort of undefined cycling areas versus dedicated bike lanes or cycle tracks or multi-use paths. This has also been able to highlight to us where we have opportunities to identify some cross-pollination between recreation and transportation. Our most heavily used corridor is the ENN, which is actually was initiated by Parks and Rec many years ago, and is now becoming the spine of the city. And with the completion of Metro, probably about this time next year, we are going to have an all ages and abilities corridor from Woodgrove to downtown. We do have this understanding, and we've understood this based on the current land use plans. We do need to see where the future land use plans are expected to take us to sort of chart a course to continue building out and prioritizing our investments. But it is quite clear that we do have some gaps in our network, and we do need to find a way to bridge them. And then that's the question of strategizing the prioritization of that and optimizing our investments. And so as we bring all of this information together, we will have a very complete picture of how we can generate this complete network. And one of the questions that we will need to ask ourselves as we go through this is what level of service we anticipate in some of our lower density neighborhoods, and how do we connect them to the system. And then on our higher classification of cycling routes, such as the ENN and Metro, what level of service do we envision providing to the community and on sort of an operational basis? And how do we prioritize that resource allocation? Next slide, please. So I think this might be the topic that most people have been most eager to get into. So regardless of where you're going or what you're doing, at some point, everybody starts their journey as a pedestrian. And it's understanding that, it's pretty clear why pedestrian mobility is the highest priority form of transportation in the city. And we do want to encourage everybody to walk whenever possible. For many years, even predating the Transportation Master Plan, city staff have prepared and used sort of technical analysis for the prioritization of pedestrian enhancements, whether it's at intersections or along corridors for sidewalks. These have typically been fairly technical in nature, and quite often have left members of the public feeling somewhat in the dark and unclear as to why one location was more valuable or a higher priority than another, or why one location was not deemed to be in need of enhancement at all. And so we wanted to try and find a way to validate what we were doing, as well as prepare or become more transparent for the community, so there's greater clarity as to why and what we're prioritizing, and also to take a step back and provide council with the opportunity to guide the conversation and to assist us with ensuring that our prioritization processes did resonate with council and with the community. And so what we've done is actually brought a active transportation planning team in to help us do a review of this. And so I'm going to actually hand the presentation over now to Mr. Gavin Davidson, who is a professional active transportation planner and who's been working with us for, I think, probably about 6 months now, maybe a little longer, to review what we currently are doing and to help us refine and explore opportunities to do better. So I will hand the slide deck over to Gavin.
Thank you, Mr. Rose.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jamie, and thanks for your presentation. My slide deck should be here somewhere there for you. Chairperson, thank you very much. That's great. So Mayor and Council, thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you this morning on the pedestrian planning scoping study that we've been undertaking for the last 6 months with Nanaimo City staff. Next, please. The study overview. This is an overview of our presentation for the day. We'll talk about the study and the peer cities that we examined as part of our research. We'll go over the findings that we've produced and talk about next steps. So the study that we undertook involved looking at existing processes to plan and implement pedestrian improvements in the city of Nanaimo. And we looked at best practices and case studies from a number of peer cities throughout the Pacific Northwest. We also looked at federal and provincial guidance on pedestrian planning, and we've made a number of recommendations for you. So in our case studies, we looked at Bellingham, Boulder, and Kelowna, and these offer some potential inspiration and guidance while exhibiting similar demographics, land use, density, and transportation infrastructure. Nanaimo's pedestrian mode share is pretty similar to these other jurisdictions here. However, the sustainable transportation mode share at 12% is significantly lower than the other jurisdictions that we looked at. And I do see that there's an opportunity to better integrate walking, cycling, and transit. In terms of the long-term sustainable mode share, Nanaimo's target is also a wee bit lower than these other jurisdictions. Next. So these steps here describe the high-level process for planning, implementing, monitoring, maintaining, promoting, and celebrating pedestrian infrastructure. And we use this framework to assess current processes. And we've made a number of recommendations that fall under these 6 categories or themes. Next. Nanaimo's Transportation Master Plan provides direction to guide transportation policies and investments within each of the transportation network and within each aspect of the transportation network. Walking is, of course, noted as a fundamental mode of transportation that forms part of every trip. The vision and goals within the Transportation Master Plan supports the city's commitments to within its official community plan and the strategic plan toward a multimodal transportation system that's inclusive, safe, accessible, affordable, and sustainable. Next. The Transportation Master Plan for Nanaimo acknowledges challenges that exist for pedestrians, including missing links and high-speed roads that create barriers to pedestrian travel. And this really is a legacy of a city for which large portions were built before city standards required new roads to have sidewalks on one or both sides, when land use patterns were characterized by low density auto-oriented development, creating long distances between home, work, services, and amenities. And yet, as the figure in the upper right-hand corner shows, and this was from a 2013 report on existing conditions in Nanaimo, it notes that over 60% of motor vehicle trips are under 4 kilometers in length. And this presents a significant opportunity to reduce reliance on the private automobile. Next, please. So this slide shows the recommendations that we've identified in terms of strategic planning. And our intention here isn't to explain in detail each of the recommendations. Instead, we plan to highlight a particular recommendation within each of the 6 categories that I mentioned, and to entertain any questions you have on the other recommendations at the end of the presentation. So with that in mind, please note any questions that you have about the recommendations, and we'll address those at the end. And for strategic planning, I'm going to provide more detail with regards to the last recommendation. Next. So Nanaimo is already taking advantage of concurrent projects to improve or extend the pedestrian network. Metro Drive was undertaken to improve traffic flow, but also to improve conditions for cyclists, and that was the primary objective. But it's also been an opportunity to improve conditions for sidewalk or for pedestrians by expanding sidewalk width and improving the visibility of pedestrian crosswalks, creating medians in the middle of those crosswalks in order to shorten those crossing distances and to provide a sense of refuge so that pedestrians feel safer and that there's a higher degree of yielding from automobile drivers. So this is certainly, I think, a real opportunity to provide a holistic approach that will create these synergies between transit and walking and cycling. Really, we want to simply encourage Nanaimo to continue along this process and to expand your efforts. Next. In terms of identification and prioritization, we specifically considered the processes used to identify and prioritize sidewalk infill and crossing treatments. Next. The process to identify and prioritize pedestrian crossing treatments and sidewalk infill attach a value to each location based on a number of different quantitative measures, resulting in a range of scores from high to low. We consider pedestrian outputs in Nanaimo and risk outputs. So the pedestrian outputs looks largely at those factors that generate trips, and particularly trips that affect people who are vulnerable road users and who are perhaps more vulnerable and may find it difficult and intimidating to be out walking in situations where there's higher speed, higher volumes of motor vehicle traffic. And that would include folks that are traveling to schools, hospitals, and senior residences in particular, and also to transit stops for that matter. The risk outputs that Nanaimo looks at includes traffic speed and volume, block length, intersection density, the quality and the extent of existing pedestrian facilities that are nearby. And these factors are combined to create a numerical output, which is the sum of risk. And essentially, those that score highly on this are given a high priority, and those that score low are given a lower priority. Unfortunately, as Jamie mentioned, the current process for sidewalk infill and crossing improvement prioritization is quite opaque. It's quite technical. And I'd also say that it's largely reactive. So it's identifying and prioritizing intersections and sidewalk infill that's driven by resident complaints. Now, this is certainly an important consideration, but there's also opportunities, I think, to be proactive and to think strategically about where do we need to build links in order to serve those highly important origins and destinations throughout the community. Next. So in order to increase public confidence, we recommend you make the process to identify and prioritize pedestrian improvements more transparent, that you use criteria that's easy to calculate, and that you establish a proactive and reactive process that considers both public complaints and concerns, but also which tries to create and look at strategic opportunities to create a network that makes those links between key origins and destinations. Next. So Bellingham really has a process that they've identified for identification and prioritization of sidewalk infill and crossing treatments. And this shows you a few of the criteria that they look at in their process. And essentially, they break it down into three aspects. They look at risks, and you see some of them here: safety, posted speed, traffic volume. And they look at pedestrian trip generators, and that comprises about 1/3. So you've got the risk factors that comprise 1/3 of the consideration and weighting, and pedestrian generators that comprise 1/3, and then economic equity that comprises the other third. And in terms of economic equity, they provide high scores for areas with subsidized rental housing and lower scores for areas where there's high-end single-family residences. And this helps them to prioritize improvements throughout the community in a way that's more transparent and, in fact, which is easier to calculate for their staff and to provide results that are more transparent, easier to understand for everyone. Next.
Chair, if I could ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and pardon the interruption. I'm just curious if you can comment. Great. If you can't, I understand. You know, areas change. This part of town Councillor Hemmons lives in is changing rapidly. I think the word is probably gentrification. And I'm just curious if there's any sort of studies, information that indicate that if you in fact encourage that kind of use and have prioritized an area, beefed up transit, pedestrian activity, etc., does that continue if the area gentrifies afterwards, or does it change?
I think it's a good question. I think that really that speaks to the issue of monitoring and evaluation. And we're going to get to that later on in the slide deck here. But I would say, you know, generally speaking, that it really depends upon a particular circumstance in a community. We've certainly seen in downtown Vancouver, where a lot of high-end condos have been built over the last 10, 20 years, that they've managed to continue to increase their pedestrian mode share. And in fact, all sustainable modes of transit and walking and cycling have all seen increases. And we've actually seen a reduction in the number of motor vehicles that are coming into downtown Vancouver at the same time. So, you know, from that example, you could say absolutely it is possible to see gentrification occur, but to see that the sustainable mode share continues to climb.
Thank you very much.
So next slide, please. Nanaimo staff currently uses professional judgment in selecting treatment options, and they take into account various considerations. So they look at existing conditions, speeding, yield compliance, latent demand. They look at available funding and resources, and opportunities and constraints that are presented by concurrent engineering projects. Next slide. This has led to the implementation of a number of variety of tactics for improving circumstances for pedestrians. So in this case at Boundary Avenue and Nightingale Crescent, we have a curb extension which shortens the crossing distance, and we have improvements to the sidewalk infrastructure there. Next. Overhead flashing lights and medians have been implemented in a number of locations, such as at Pine Street and Wentworth Street, which make it easier for pedestrians to cross and allows them to find refuge while crossing the street. Next. And we've seen various kinds of traffic calming like this raised crossing on Cliff Road near Comox Road. Next. So in terms of the selection of treatment options, the recommendations that we have are for Nanaimo to consider a decision-making flow chart that will guide staff towards particular treatment options in order to allow for a higher degrees of consistency and efficiency in that process. To allow for exceptions and consideration of other options, we recommend that you implement experimentation, allowing ongoing learning, and to respond to the needs of particular communities. We recommend that you make the selection process more transparent so that stakeholders, the public, and decision makers are given a higher degree of confidence. And we recommend that you align treatment options with best practices and use monitoring and evaluation to assess ongoing performance and to make adjustments if needs be. Next. So I'm going to focus here on making the selection process more transparent. And the figure that you see here on your slide is from the City of Vancouver. And they use this to illustrate the fact that some kinds of treatment options like additional crossing time or signage or adding a countdown timer, these things are easy to do and don't cost a great deal of money, so they can be implemented quite quickly. But other measures, curb ramps, sidewalks, signals, for example, tend to cost a lot more and require more time to implement. And this type of an approach helps the public to understand the rationale as to why certain improvements occur quickly and others may take more time. Next. Implementation. So the existing processes memo that we undertook as part of this study addressed a number of factors that influence the timing, extent, and specific sidewalk infill and crossing treatments that are constructed in Nanaimo. So those factors include, for example, the availability of funding and in particular project readiness. So is land acquisition required, cross-jurisdictional ownership, requirement of departmental alignment? These all will influence the timing of implementation. Next. In terms of recommendations, we would recommend that Nanaimo be clear about factors that influence implementation and report those regularly to council and to the public. That Nanaimo leverage inspiration from those jurisdictions that have achieved ambitious cross-jurisdictional projects and who have been successful in acquiring money from all levels of governments for those ambitious projects. We recommend you seek out alliances to pursue shared objectives and to spark public, stakeholder, and political interest, and that you focus limited resources where they will leverage impact, including, for example, where high density mixed land use exists or is planned. Next. So Nanaimo staff are seeking opportunities to better integrate new developments with pedestrian improvements. For example, Nanaimo's progress towards pedestrian improvements on Stewart Avenue may depend to some extent on your ability to tie those improvements to a larger initiative to achieve waterfront development and renewal. Development of clear and focused policy direction through development and transportation planning processes will allow Nanaimo to take advantage of development to leverage pedestrian improvements. Next. Evaluation of sidewalk infill and pedestrian crossing treatments following implementation offers an opportunity to address evolving safety concerns and to gain insight into ways and means to achieve ongoing improvements in treatment options. A lack of monitoring and evaluation, by contrast, makes it really difficult to track progress towards achieving municipal goals and makes it harder to know what treatments should be prioritized. There are currently limited municipal resources in Nanaimo that are explicitly dedicated towards compiling applicable data to assess impacts of pedestrian improvements. Next. We therefore recommend that you establish and track progress towards a robust set of targets, that you include long-range and achievable interim targets, and that you recognize that both perceived and objectively measured outcomes are important, and that you use both to inform the decision-making process, so that you track collisions involving pedestrians as well as pedestrians' perceived sense of safety, as both of these will influence people's propensity to walk. Next. The city identified a number of goals for walking as part of its 2014 Transportation Master Plan, including making walking safer, more comfortable, more accessible, and creating more and better places to walk, ultimately encouraging more people to walk more often. Yet the sole measure that Nanaimo committed to increase walking trips from 8.5% of all trips in 2014 to 12% of all trips in 2041. Now, this is a laudable goal. I think it's wonderful, but I do think that it would be important to establish measurable interim targets so that we're able to track progress and adjust our policies and actions to meet those targets over time. So in this case, I think it would have been helpful to have had a target for 2020, for 2025 and 2030, and to monitor and track progress towards those so that we could ratchet up the policies and the actions that we've identified to make sure that we're on track to hit that longer term target. Next. Communication and engagement is noted as a key challenge and priorities in Nanaimo's 2020 business plan for engineering and public works. Staff also note that public engagement remains an important priority as part of the ongoing Reimagine Nanaimo process. And I've been very impressed by the manner in which Nanaimo has committed to ongoing engagement. I think this photograph here is a perfect example of that. Here we see a Reimagine Nanaimo stakeholder meeting that's taking place in a distant manner, and it's a good thing it's not raining here, because they'd all be getting wet. But it is wonderful to see such commitment to ongoing stakeholder engagement, regardless of the circumstances. Next. So in collaboration with your communications and media relations team, we recommend that you create a high-level communications and engagement strategy and a more detailed project-specific communication and engagement strategy. That you expand the diversity and frequency of engagement opportunities, and that you include celebration as a way to build community buy-in. Next. And I don't want to suggest that Nanaimo doesn't already utilize celebration. Here's an example of a celebration as part of the Georgia Greenway Phase 1 opening. I simply want to encourage you to continue and to do more of this, particularly as we emerge from COVID. I think it's going to be a huge opportunity to celebrate your active transportation infrastructure and improvements, and to encourage people to continue to make use of that infrastructure going forward. Next. So, as I said, we made 19 recommendations, and we broke those down into 6 categories that reflect the planning process. We looked at strategic planning, identification and prioritization of locations for improvements, selection of treatment options, implementation, monitoring and evaluation, and communication and engagement. And we look forward to working with you to consider and, where appropriate, to implement these recommendations going forward. Next. Sorry, next. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we're right there. Thank you. So we would like to suggest that some of the immediate next steps that we need to take are to update the processes for sidewalk infill and roadway crossing treatment implementation. We'd like to recommend that you align the tool with Nanaimo's goals and that you refine the selection and prioritization tool in order to make it easier to calculate and more transparent and easier to understand. And that you update assessments that have been done previously. There are about 200 intersections that you've assessed to date, and that you migrate those into a new tool. Then we recommend that you use that updated tool to proactively assess high priority locations where we can begin to really create a network of active transportation routes that will serve walking and cycling to connect between major origins and destinations throughout the community. We then recommend that you compare and reprioritize the locations that you've looked at through reassessment and through a proactive process, and that you communicate any adjustments to stakeholders and to the public so that they're aware of how your process is evolving. Next. In terms of the medium term, we recommend that you develop a long-range pedestrian master plan that aligns with future land use, and that you create a plan that will identify quantifiable targets that reflect your goals for more walking, for safer facilities, for improved equity and improved accessibility, and that you establish short and long-range targets to keep Nanaimo on track to achieve its long-range vision. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you, and I think we're open to responding to any questions or comments that you may have.
You're muted, Zenny.
Thank you very much for the presentation. The first person today is Councillor Turley.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to the presenter. The one area of concern that I have, and I haven't seen it addressed, and maybe it's because of me not reading as much as I should, but that is the area of commercial deliveries, because, of course, during the pandemic, that industry has grown in leaps and bounds. And having been in the flower business most of my life, where deliveries were a key part of the business model, we were always focusing on the number of deliveries we can get out in an hour as a way of routing, and also which routes we take to get them out so that it becomes fairly efficient. The challenge I see with some of these new developments of complete streets is the lack of pullouts for transit buses. And of course, the challenge is you get behind one of those and it's a frequent stopper, it can throw the delivery timing off fairly significantly. And I wonder if there's been any studies or information that have been done on that particular aspect of transportation.
Thank you. Mr. Rose?
Thank you, through the chair. So I think that with respect to the servicing of goods movement, that sort of falls outside of this conversation, but it is definitely something that we've been looking at through the development of the Complete Streets road standards. And it's also become something that's quite topical with the allocation of curb space. We're actually seeing a huge increase in demand for short-term pickup and drop-off, whether it's things like Skip the Dishes or Amazon. And so that is, I feel like maybe this was a planted question, so I appreciate that. It's something that we just thought of it. So it is something that we need to have a conversation about, because when I get back into the slide deck, I'm going to touch on this, because goods movement is something that's essential to our daily lives and our economy, and we need to ensure that we are sort of freeing up space and capacity to make sure that that the goods movement and emergency responses are able to navigate through the community while still supporting walking and biking and transit infrastructure.
Thank you.
I have a question just before I get to the others. When it comes to Boulder, Colorado, and I know that in the United States it might be a little bit different, but how do they achieve 42% of sustainable transportation mode?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what they've managed to do is to build a community that really is aligned behind this objective. And they've got a transit system that functions very well to serve many of people's transportation needs. They have a really effective cycling network as well that also serves key origins and destinations. It's interesting that their pedestrian mode share is relatively low. It's just a wee bit lower at 5%, the Nanaimo's mode share. But really, it's about allowing these sustainable modes to work together to serve people's needs.
Thank you. I have Councillor Hemmons and then Councillor Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Mr. Davidson. So I've always felt that staff had a pretty strong handle on, we have finite resources, but a whole bunch of projects we could tackle. And I'm curious about, in your explorations of other communities, one of the sticking points is that the community doesn't know, when I say I have X problem at Y crosswalk, they don't know where that sits in our decision-making tree, and whether that is one, they're the only one with the issue, or whether we've received 150 emails about that. So for me, it's not necessarily the process of identifying, it's making it more transparent. And so I'm wondering if you can reflect on those communities that you researched and whether they have any processes around transparency, so the community really understands that the Transportation Planning Department has a process, they're following it, and here's how resident input impacts that or not.
Yeah, I do think that it's a matter of describing your process and making sure that it's very clear, to advertise the priorities that have been established for the short term, and to track your progress in terms of accomplishing those targets. And Bellingham does that pretty well through a web-based portal that people can visit. It means that they're not bothering staff too much, so that they can get an understanding of what are the priorities that have been established, where are they in the process, and what the impacts are once they've been constructed and are being monitored. So there's just a process that can be developed there that kind of layers things, layers an understanding so that the public has a clear awareness of where a particular project is in the process and how it's performing.
Thank you.
And
Councillor Hemmons.
just a follow-up, if I may, I'd just like to, at the next stage of this process, I'd like to ask staff in terms of any plans we have or thoughts we have on ways to create that, oh, hey, Cheryl, you're not muted, ways that we can create that transparency for the community.
Thank you. Councillor Thorpe.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to Mr. Davidson, thank you for the report. I enjoyed reading it. I found it very clear, and I like your recommendations. I have two comments / questions that I think follow up on both the first two that you've just received. First, to Councillor Hemmons' comment, I totally agree. I think staff do a great job, but what's maybe missing to some extent that would make all of our lives easier is the greater transparency of the process of identification and prioritizing. And I really like the chart earlier in your slide deck from Bellingham with the points assigned, although I'd appreciate maybe a little bit more clarification on the economic equity where there's a scale of 0 to 34 points, which seems really extreme to me, but that's a detail. I like that transparent aspect of it. And I'd certainly hope that we can follow through with improving our efforts in that area and taking some of the political aspects of what certain residents see as priority and when they don't know what else is happening elsewhere in the city. And not to go on too long, I'd like to also go back to Councillor Turley's comment because I think it's very valid, and I recognize we're talking primarily about active transportation. And my challenge with it often is that active transportation, biking, pedestrian improvements seem to affect the mobility of our commercial vehicles and our vehicle traffic. And so I'm all in favor of improving pedestrian accessibility and safety, of course. I sometimes personally think that our spending on bike paths is wasteful, but that's beside the point today. But the reality is, if we narrow our lanes for commercial traffic, it also affects transit and its ability to move around. It increases frustration for motorists, and that leads to more safety problems. So I'm all in favor of complete streets and better options for biking and cycling, or biking and walking rather, but not at the detriment of improving traffic flow, and especially, as Councillor Turley said, to transit and commercial vehicles. So I don't know if you have any follow-up comment on that. Thank you.
Mr. Davidson?
I'm happy to comment, and I would just say that it really needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. In Calgary, we implemented 6 kilometers of protected cycling facilities, and we took away a lane of traffic on each of the streets that we were operating on there. And they saw no appreciable difference in the travel times on those corridors. I think that at the most there was an impact of maybe 30 or 40 seconds of travel time across the corridor. So it really depends on the circumstances and the situation that you're looking at. And again, I think monitoring and evaluation is really key to be able to understand the impacts. And quite often what we see now is that communities are implementing some repair work or what have you that allow them to get an understanding of, oh, okay, if we remove a lane here, what kind of impact is it going to have? And they're, going through their just basic maintenance and using that as an opportunity to be able to understand these impacts in case they decide to go with a more permanent implementation. And so I would encourage Nanaimo to take advantage of, tricks like that to be able to understand what the impacts might be of, say, reducing capacity or narrowing travel lanes.
Thank you very much.
And I see Mr. Rose with his hand up.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to make a quick comment, and in fact, I think actually Mr. Davidson sort of touched on that, in that we prioritize walking, biking, and transit very highly, but we have to acknowledge that emergency response, goods movement, and our service sectors do need to move through our community. And so, Nanaimo does have a number of roads that have arguably an excessive capacity. And so we've been able to optimize that and reallocate space. There are some that it's a little bit more unknown as to how how much capacity they do or do not have to I suppose give up is the term. But I think that this is a situation, and we're on a staff level, we're quite aware of this. And so what we actually are aspiring to do is to do some of these semi-experimental projects to test the waters and see what the consequence is, to ensure that we do not unravel things unnecessarily. And so council's been very supportive of things historically, and I'm hopeful that we can continue to give you confidence that we will make sure we don't muddy things up too badly just in favor of a benefit here or there. So
Thank you, Mr. Rose. And I see we've inspired Mr. Sims to put his hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Much appreciated. Just one of the other challenges that you're very well aware that we deal with is that perception of change as opposed to the reality of change. I think Mr. Davidson was talking about looking at it from a factual point of view, is when he was referring to Calgary. But certainly we have this, an area in town where there's an upcoming development that we believe is going to be disastrous to a very local street, but in fact, there's no real evidence of that whatsoever. So we often struggle with the perception that people bring with them or the emotions that come with that. And I think that's one of the things that hopefully becoming more transparent deals with, but as well keeping things factual. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks, Mr. Rose and Mr. Davidson, for the presentation. Interesting discussion that I'm not going to weigh in here because I just have a question. So when it comes to the sustainable modes, I know pretty in-depthly that when it comes to the transit future plan, it's a good document that's not chronically underfunded. So a lot of the goals that it was attempting to achieve based in the past term and the previous term, the decisions were made not to fund transit to the levels that essentially needed to happen to achieve those goals. So I'm just wondering, when it comes to this refinement of the active transportation plan and the goals that were articulated in the TMP with respect to the active modes, and I understand it's probably harder to quantify than just say transit hours per year and the dollar sign that goes with that, but are we behind in our infrastructure implementation, and do we have some sort of measurement of how far behind we are in that implementation? We are. I'm just thinking about Mr. Rose, your comments around, we haven't seen some modal shifts, and I do know there's been a lot of infrastructure pieces, but again, like when we develop a transit line, it doesn't go and then stop and then go and then stop. It's one contiguous line. So I'm just curious, are we meeting the goals of the TMP itself in terms of infrastructure?
Are you, sorry, just for clarity, in regards to transit specifically or globally?
No, sorry, just the active modes.
Okay, so walking, biking, and transit. So within the Transportation Master Plan, we really only had an implementation program for cycling. The walking was sort of seek opportunities, infill as and when possible. Transit was, again, work with RDN and BC Transit to provide stronger integration. So there's not really a hard metric for either of those two. The cycling infrastructure, I would say that we're probably relatively on track on a sort of per kilometer basis. However, it's a little bit muddled because we've been more opportunistic and sort of seized opportunities to say, hey, we're doing an asset renewal, we're doing paving, we're doing a utility upgrade over here. So let's spend some of our dollars here and get this section complete, instead of just fixating on, focusing on our higher user areas, the area between downtown VIU and NRGH, and building out from there. So, yes and no, I suppose, is the answer, unfortunately. And so but definitely bridging the gaps is a priority. And so when we get back into the slide deck, I think there's some elements that I really want to draw everybody's attention back to in the context of transportation, and then as we go into the conversation this afternoon about land use planning. So, yeah, so we can either jump back in if there's any other questions for Mr. Davidson or on any of the background information we've gathered so far.
I don't see any further hands up, so I think we can jump back in unless anybody wants a 5-minute break. Nope. Okay, jump back in.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much. So, all of this discussion has sort of referred back to all of our gathering ideas phase and gathering information, and now we're getting into phase 2, which is this exploring options and discussing opportunities phase. And so I know I showed this slide previously, but I want to bring it back, and I can't overemphasize the correlation between land use planning and mobility planning. In order for mobility planning to be successful, we have to make very conscious decisions on our land use planning. The inverted pyramid, pedestrians, bicycles, transit, commercial, and personal vehicles, I think everybody is very familiar with. And as I touched on earlier, at some point we are all pedestrians. We start that way when we walk out of our homes and when we get to our destinations. A facet that we tend not to talk about quite as much, and maybe just not openly, but maybe there is an awareness of it, but I do want to just reinforce, there is this other element to the image, and that's the land use arrow on the right. And that's relating to land use density. The greater density we have, the more walkable, bikeable, and more efficiently we can use transit to serve our community. The less dense the land use area is, the more dependent people are on personal vehicles. And it's not to suggest that high density and low density are good and bad for every single situation. It's just an awareness of, if we are seeking to encourage people to walk and bike, we do need to focus our growth in a specific area, and then support that with infrastructure and service. The image on the right, I have also presented previously, and I think we've all talked about this sort of notion of a conventional versus a traditional road network. But I do want to draw it back to this bottom image and bottom piece of information, all of which is in the Transportation Master Plan, but highlighting that the traditional high redundancy road network provides a lot more opportunity to make walking and biking desirable options to move within the community. If we have high density areas with a strong road network, these trips are far more appealing in a walking or biking mode than they need to be for vehicle movement. I mean, if you've got a fairly compact downtown area, then you can walk to walk from home to your services, to your employment. And, it's not unrealistic to think that it would take you more time to move your car and find a parking spot than it would be just to walk from point A to point B. And so when we go into the conversation this afternoon, there are the land use scenarios. I'd really like to have everybody's mind in this sort of space to be thinking about how we can envision the growth of our communities and how that will then integrate back into providing the transportation support system. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned early on, safety is a overarching priority and vision for mobility in our city. It affects everybody, whether you're walking, biking, or driving, and it's something that it's essential. And so as we go into the conversations, this isn't quite as explicitly tied to land use, but I do want to bring some attention and awareness to the goals that have been identified through phase 1 of Reimagine to reduce transportation injury rates, how they tie to Vision Zero, which is actually a notion of reducing injuries and severe injuries and fatalities to zero, while acknowledging that there are still some property damage MVAs that may occur. And then also touch on what processes are being implemented around the world to try and achieve this objective. Now, we will be doing a deep dive in phase 3 to help explore the scenarios and the strategies to affect this change. But I just want to make sure this information is out there and that we're all able to ask questions, discuss it, or seek additional information prior to getting into that workshop, because it's essential that we provide you and the community with the information that's going to help draw us to the answer that's best for us. Right now, it seems that the safer systems approach is the sort of front-running best practice, and what that identifies is 4 areas of focus: the driver, operating speed, road designs, and vehicle designs. Now, obviously, municipalities don't have a huge influence over vehicle design, so we need to let that industry take care of itself. Within the driver, what it refers to is the enforcement side and the education side. We understand that drivers are there's a potential for errors there. So we need to reinforce that when we have speed limits and when we have traffic control devices, that they abide by them. And so as a municipality, we have the ability to influence prioritization of enforcement, but we don't have the influence over the legal system, or to a lesser degree the provincial legislation. So enforcement is an area that we would need to focus on in that realm. The road design standards, we've kind of talked about this in bits and pieces already. The complete streets road designs that we've adopted fairly recently are actually founded on Vision Zero principles. So they are separating pedestrians from cyclists from motorists, and giving everybody their space. They're also founded on creating an environment where it is less comfortable for motorists to speed. And so that then gets into the next. The challenge with that is then being able to implement those upgrades and how we prioritize them. The last facet is vehicle operating speed, and again, I think we've had various conversations about this, but there's no refuting any of the information. The slower a vehicle's going, the more survivable a collision is. And so, and that doesn't just specifically relate to pedestrian collisions, that is vehicle-vehicle collisions as well. And so as we're in the process of moving forward with implementing our complete street designs, which are inherently traffic calmed, we do need to have a discussion about ways to manage operating speed throughout the rest of our existing system. We've had lots of conversations recently about traffic calming, and I think we have demonstrated that a variety of approaches have varying degrees of success. I think it's become evident that signage alone has very minimal impact. And so we need to be mindful of what the conversation looks like and how we approach the aspiration to reduce vehicle speeds, and identify any potential drawbacks of that. And sort of going back to previous conversations, we know that things like goods movement and emergency responses need to be accommodated, but how can we do that while still ensuring that we have a safe system? And so this is sort of a bit of a backgrounder and setting some baseline information for a future conversation, but also opening the door for any discussions that the council would like to entertain right now. Sorry, next slide, please. Right, and so phase 2, we'll be going into the land use discussion. We will be having 2 more workshops, one dedicated to a deeper dive on the pedestrian discussion, talking about how we can become more transparent, how we can streamline our process, and how we can work to prioritize the needs of council and the community to enhance our walking system. We will also be having a collaborative presentation and workshop with the RDN as the transit redevelopment strategy starts to gain a bit more momentum. And we'll be then aligning those with the land use plans that will be developed through the next discussion. And then as we migrate into phase 3, we'll be able to start talking about the hard implementation expectations and how we intend to move the active transportation plan forward in line with the OCP and Parks and Rec master plan and all of the other complementary processes that are underway. And so, again, I'd like to open up to any questions or discussions.
You're muted, Zenny.
Thank you very much. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. I just have a couple questions. When we talk about the complete road designs, I know that having, and I'm just drawing from conversations I've had with some of the traffic reconstructionists and analysts about the Metro Drive complete project, where they feel actually accidents will go up because now you've got drivers that can't even back out of their driveways in the own lane. They've got to go into oncoming traffic. They've got to go through a sidewalk, then a bicycle lane, and then also watch for traffic. So they feel that there's going to be more chances taken. And I think that's bared out by studies in Surrey where some of their complete streets, the accident levels did go up. Can you comment on that?
I can't comment explicitly on the outcomes from Surrey because I haven't seen the reports, but what I can highlight is the expectation that with the separation of modalities and the reduced speeds expected along that corridor, my expectation would be that if there are collisions, they will be far less severe than prior to the implementation. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but I think it's fairly safe to say that we expect to see a significant reduction in speed along that corridor.
As a follow-up to that, I sent you numerous studies out of the States which actually debunked that theory. I don't know if you got a chance to read them or not. The concern that I have, and I've talked to people that do speed, you know, and in the past I was one. What happens is that the first 3 or 4 months, yeah, you slow down, but then you get comfortable with it, and the speeds just keep going right back up. So, are we going to be assessing that as well?
Will we be conducting follow-up assessments at a sort of a more longer term horizon? Yeah,
just to see, like, have the accidents gone, and let's not forget some of the accidents we won't hear about because people will choose not to go through ICBC, but perhaps we can get those records from the police when they don't go through ICBC. It's just a concern I have based on a lot of the research I've done out of the States where they've actually gone back and done looking at it 3 years later, not just a year later or 2 years later. So I think it'd be interesting to just do the follow-up, see how it does work. Hopefully it does.
Yep, I completely understood, and I think that actually sort of speaks back to some of the information that Mr. Davidson was suggesting, and not only under the sort of the pedestrian realm, but as a whole, having a more strategic and cyclical review of our system to sort of have that longer term evaluation of successes, and even to Councillor Turley and Thorpe's questions about sort of long-term impacts to you know, vehicle progression and travel times. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I wasn't here for all of that. I was at the FCM at another session, so I apologize if that was a repeat question.
Thank you, Councillor Armstrong. Councillor Brown.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Through you to most likely Mr. Rose. I'm curious at the end of this process, you know, as we do the refinement and you know, the engagement around the goals, and then start to put in the plan in place. Will there be sort of a translation of the ambitions of the plan into sort of what a funding formula might look like to achieve the plan? So, you know, for example, I really like the approach with the asset management where you identified the gap, and then you know, City of Nanaimo for some time has had that 1% dedicated funding envelope to ultimately close the gap over the time. And I've been, you know, sort of kicking that idea around in my head for a bit of, you know, how we have sort of these, you know, for lack of a better word, sprawl gap, and that, you know, the expectations of the community. And so how do we look at closing that gap over time with, you know, some of this and that kind of infill, but the gaps that we probably aren't going to be addressed via development?
Through the chair. And so short answer is yes. Long answer is we need to have a little bit more information brought to the table for us to be able to start generating those identifiers. And so we need to understand the land use plan that we're going to be moving forward with, and then be able to start identifying how the prioritization aligns with that. Because as we sort of reach back to the pyramid and the land use equation, if we have a fairly dense, compact focal point, then our abilities to address the gaps within that become a lot easier. Whereas if we have a more diffuse, sort of separated areas, not only do we have more areas to cover, we have more competing interests to balance off. So the conversation becomes far more complex.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you, depending on the models chosen, will undoubtedly influence the cost and service level as we move forward.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. And I am not seeing anybody else with their hands up. So I guess we will be having more of this afternoon in our Reimagine workshop. So, with the will of the council, I would like a 5-minute break. So, Ms. Gurry, is it okay to take a 5-minute break?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, no problem at all. 5 minutes. Council can return at 11:35.
Thank you.
2, 3, 4.
Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. So we'll move on now to under community wellness and livability. The motion brought forward by myself regarding permanent recreational vehicle, asking council to direct staff to prepare a report on the options available to support permanent recreation vehicle accommodation. And it's Mr. Jeremy Holm who's going to present this.
Madam Chair, I'll just introduce it for a moment, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Holm. Good morning, good morning, council members. As you mentioned, Madam Chair, this is originated from a motion that was made at your council meeting of April the 19th. The motion being that council directs staff prepare a report on options available to support permanent recreation vehicle accommodation. That motion was deferred at that time, and it was moved forward to the next GPC meeting, which was April 26th. Due to time constraints, you didn't get to it at your meeting of the April 26th, so it's been brought forward today. What's important to note is that the motion itself was deferred to GPC for further discussion. So that motion has not passed, and staff have not prepared a report. What we have done is put forward some information that Mr. Holm will go through in a moment here, just on kind of the background and the history around recreational vehicles and the regulation of permanent residency within RVs in the city of Nanaimo, because we do have probably some different rules that apply to us, different than many other communities. So unless there's any questions on that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Holm and have him walk through his few slides here.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, Madam Chair and committee members, and thank you for allowing me to present on this topic. And as Mr. Lindsay mentioned, the purpose is just to provide a bit of context and ensure you have some information on the current provisions for RVs within the city of Nanaimo, accommodation within RVs, and also, I guess, as within your role on the speaking of context, within your role on the Regional District of Nanaimo Board, you're aware that the topic of tiny homes is also under review at the Regional District Board level as well. But in the city context, Nanaimo is actually has several different approaches to accommodating recreational vehicle accommodation. There's short-term provisions for accommodation within an RVs for non-paying guests of residential properties, and that's for it's limited to so it's non-paying guests, and it's limited to 42 days out of a calendar year. Thanks for the slideshow there. It's helpful if you could go to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, so as I was mentioning, a couple different provisions for temporary accommodation within RVs. So non-paying guests are allowed within on single-family dwelling properties up to 42 days in a calendar year, and that's sort of a provision for guests to stay with or visitors to stay with residents of the city on a short-term basis. Also provided for is accommodation within RVs during construction. So in the course of property being developed under active building permit, accommodation within RVs is provided for, subject to the fact that it's not rented or subletted. Again, so non-paying provision there. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And again, a little bit longer term and sort of a different purpose, I guess, as temporary accommodation within campgrounds. So that's limited to 90 days within a calendar year, and campgrounds are permitted within the AR1 zone. And there are specific regulations that guide the services, the provision of services and standards within campgrounds. But this is more targeted at tourist accommodation, and which is actually an important piece of the local economy and definitely a consideration around provision for tourist accommodation is important to folks that would like to come and enjoy the many amenities and the beauty of Nanaimo on a short-term basis, as in recreational vehicles, as generally intended for within campgrounds. If you could go to the next slide, please. And then actually unique to Nanaimo and something that has been in place for a while, but is not, I guess, maybe widely known, but is definitely something that is relatively unique to Nanaimo, is the provision for temporary or permanent accommodation within recreational vehicle parks. So there's a bit of history here, and I won't go into the full depth of it, but within the recreational vehicle park zone, the R11 zone, recreational vehicles are allowed on a temporary or permanent basis, and there are a number of properties within the city. I'll touch on a couple of them that are that do accommodate that use, and that's the interesting thing. They are developed under standards similar to campgrounds, and so they provide for the servicing, access, all the amenities that support provision of open space and amenities that support recreational vehicle accommodation. But there is no limit on within the R11 zone on the length of stay. So there are some parks within town, and if you go to the next slide, please, I'll highlight a couple of them that that allow, and here's some definitions for you, sorry, but I've more or less covered that. But in this case, this is a living forest campground, and this is at Mackey Road, and you can see that part of the property is zoned R11 and part of it is zoned AR1. So within the AR1 zone, that's considered campground accommodation, and then within the R11 zone, that's it would feel very much similar as far as the standards that apply, but there is the capacity for the operator to rent those spaces on a long-term basis. So that's one property within the city that has actually both the campground and long-term accommodation potential there. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And here are another couple of properties within the city that that allow a long-term accommodation within recreational vehicles. The Resort on the Lake is the property at 1142 Wass Lake Drive. That's on the left, and that's actually an interesting one. It's actually a Bearland strata, so individual ownership of individual lots within a recreational vehicle resort, and they have the capacity to rent those out on an ongoing basis, or somebody could live within an RV there, or on an ongoing basis on their own property. In the same vicinity, on the right, you see 380 Westwood Road. That property also has a provision for long-term accommodation in RVs, and the operator does take advantage of that, as well as a portion of the property is otherwise zoned, but there is provision for accommodation within RVs. And there, in this property, in the case of this property, there are a number of small cabins as well on the property. If you could go to the next slide, please. So that's actually just, yeah, that's a unique to Nanaimo, interesting piece of our history, and which many communities don't allow for long-term accommodation RVs. We have several sites that do. And those are subject to standards and regulations that ensure that appropriate provisions for servicing and access and open space are provided. So permanent accommodation in RVs, there are some challenges obviously around that. They're not generally designed for permanent accommodation. They're not held to, they're a Canadian Standards Association certification. They're not held to the same standard as a dwelling unit would be to building code with respect to safety. Site servicing can be a challenge for these types of units. As I mentioned, the campgrounds and RV parks are actually serviced specifically to accommodate recreational vehicles. And that's an important consideration. RVs are also they're not permitted to connect directly to city services, and they don't generally meet the water pressure provisions are not adequate on properties outside of RV parks for those types of units. So servicing is definitely a challenge. Some other considerations: fire protection. That sometimes the RVs are generally not. The electrical systems are of I guess a lower standard than would be for a dwelling unit. They can become overloaded as well. There can be challenges with exiting because they have a limited exiting capacity in the event of a fire, and as well there can be challenges with carbon monoxide exposure in recreational vehicles. As well, there are neighborhood impacts potentially if you're looking at accommodation outside of recreational vehicle parks or campgrounds. If you're talking about accommodation within neighborhoods, definitely there can be some concerns, and in fact we as council is well aware, the city reacts to complaints as it responds in enforcement on its bylaws, and oftentimes the complaints are related to RVs are related to neighborhood impacts in some cases of residents that have or landlords, I guess, that have taken advantage of folks that are causing, unfortunately, disturbances to neighbors. There are, anecdotally, there are many cases where people are residing temporarily or, longer term, possibly even through the pandemic situation where families have had to separate if somebody's in a more challenging, maybe higher exposure line of work, and they have family members that could potentially be exposed. We know of anecdotally of cases where family members have been residing in RVs on property throughout the pandemic. We know of other cases, and it's evident around town where folks are living in RVs, whether on within road rights of way or private property. But generally, we're acting on a complaint basis, and we generally, when we do respond, it's related to neighborhood impacts. And there are some other considerations that I should probably touch on here too. Equity in the way of taxation and user rates. So for instance, in the case of a recreational vehicle park or campground, they're providing the appropriate services and they're being charged the appropriate user rates for those services to pay for their share. As well, they're taxed on the basis of the use that and the business they're operating, the use of the land that is being undertaken. So there's equity considerations in relation to taxation and user rates as it relates to RV accommodation. If you could go to the next slide, please. And thank you. And so there is a provision or a recommendation in the affordable housing strategy that recommends consideration of allowing accommodation in recreational vehicles within mobile home parks and possibly in other residential areas. So that does sort of connect with the or align with the motion that was on the table for council's consideration. And there's possibility of considering some of this through the Reimagine Nanaimo process with regard to kind of considering is there appropriate land within the city that could be in addition to the existing accommodation in recreational vehicle parks and campgrounds. Is there additional land that would be appropriate for that type of use? Also could consider through Reimagine possibly the types of tools that we could use to, a council could consider to allow broader accommodation in recreational vehicles if that's appropriate. and that those could be, say, for instance, temporary use permit, maybe citing criteria, that type of thing. So yeah, those are some things that we could kind of explore through the Reimagine process to some extent. So in line with the affordable housing strategy, there's also a recommendation to, and this is kind of broadening out the conversation a little bit, but council should be aware to the strategy also recommends expanding secondary suites more broadly, which the city has accommodated in residential areas since 2005. So we're quite an early adopter of secondary suites in residential areas, and there's an opportunity to consider possibly the more broad application of secondary suites. And that's also a recommendation coming out of the affordable housing strategy. Council will probably remember that a recent amendment to the zoning bylaw that actually allowed modular dwelling units to be used as an accessory suite, secondary suite in an accessory building. That was a 2019 amendment to the zoning bylaw. So that allows a modular dwelling to constitute a secondary suite as an accessory building in residential areas. So that's with certain lot area and parameters there, but that was a recent expansion. Some other things I probably want to touch on just briefly. I'm happy to take questions afterwards, but there's some concern that expanding accommodation into permanently into RVs sort of, and you've heard this from folks in the industry as well, potentially downgrades what's acceptable as permanent housing, and could in fact delay more permanent appropriate solutions that we're seeing we've seen the market respond to the housing demand in the city, and there is the concern that expanding accommodations into permanent accommodation into lower standard forms of housing could delay or discourage investments in permanent solutions like that. So that's definitely a consideration, as well as I mentioned earlier, neighborhood considerations. RV parks and campgrounds provide appropriate amenities. They provide for servicing and open space for recreational vehicles that generally wouldn't be well accommodated in residential areas, and they could constitute a nuisance or a problem in residential areas with regard to parking and other implications. I'm happy to take any questions. I think that's all I had to say in the way of background, but I'm happy to take any questions if the committee has any.
Thank you, Mr. Holm. I've got a speakers list, so I've got Councillor Turley first, and then Councillor Hemmons, then Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Mr. Holm. So the concern that strikes me first is the capacity for a recreational vehicle to hold a volume of sewage and gray water. And if there is a mini, and I'll preface my question, I've never had a motorhome or a camper for that matter. So the question is, are there sani stations available within the city where these vehicles could go and offload their excess waste?
Yes, there are. I have had an RV personally, and I have used some sani services within the city. I'm not aware of exactly where they're located now, but I know some campgrounds they have the appropriate facilities as well. I believe, and it may not be the case now, but Canadian Tire used to have sani service provisions, but the RV parks that exist often allow users from other areas to dispose of their waste for a fee.
Thank you.
Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm hearing that Living Forest has a specific zone that allows, or we have zoning that allows for recreational vehicles. And then we have mobile home parks, and that's Westwood Lake and the other one. Do we know if those are oversubscribed and if there's a community desire to see more mobile home parks or more expansion of that zoning into maybe mobile home parks so recreational vehicles could be accommodated there?
I did, this was probably about a month ago, but I did canvass a couple of the parks, and so we have the recreational vehicle parks. So that's Resort on the Lake and Westwood RV, and then Living Forest. Those are the three that are the R11 zoned recreational vehicle parks. I did canvass them briefly, and they did have wait lists at that time. Although they were saying this has been a bit of an unusual period because they were they weren't expecting the seasonal travelers that they typically do, although that may be changing as we reopen for the summer, coming out of COVID, or hopefully expanding our ability to travel as we're making way on COVID.
Thank you.
Councillor Bonner.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, if I may. I'm reading over the motion that we passed, and I don't think today's report is that motion. And so I'm wondering, are we going to get options on how to provide accommodations? Because what I was kind of looking for today was if council wants to go down the road of allowing recreational vehicles to be parked in somebody's backyard, what do we need to put in place to make sure that everybody's protected? And so that's kind of what I'm looking for. Is that an option that we could look at? And if we do, what bylaws do we need to change or put into place so that we can actually do that? So that's what I'm kind of looking for.
So, yeah, through the chair, if that's okay, I can speak to that.
Yes.
So yeah, the motion actually wasn't passed; it was tabled. Okay. So the idea was this was just to provide some context for council in consideration of the motion. So what is the current context with regard to recreational vehicle accommodation in Nanaimo? So that was the purpose of this presentation. Definitely, if you were to look at, if council were to want to pursue expanding accommodation within RVs, there would definitely, we'd be recommending and coming back with a more fulsome analysis and recommendations. As I mentioned, I've touched on some of the potential concerns and issues that could come up, and yeah, that's something that we'd want to explore, likely do consultation in regard to, because there's definitely potential for, if it's expanded more broadly as of right, there's definitely some potential for some negative implications and community concern around that.
Yeah, and I apologize, I forgot the motion hadn't actually been passed. So my, what I would like to know is I would look at them similar to how we would look at a carriage house or something along those lines. And I would expect that we'd be looking at proper sewer connections, proper electrical, like work would have to be done on a house to be able to make this thing happen. So those are the sort of things I would be looking at, not to have something that's like semi-permanent where you'd have to drive each week to get rid of your gray water, black water. Having lived in a recreational vehicle for probably about 6 or 8 months, it's not an easy thing to do. There's all kind of questions about humidity and stuff like that, but I think it should be some sort of option. And if you wish to go down this road, these are all the things that a homeowner would have to do before they could actually bring something into their backyard. That's what I would hope that we eventually get to at this point. Thank you.
And Mayor Croak.
Thank you very much. I'm just wondering, Mr. Holm, if you can comment. I know that, Vancouver is now moving to ensure that people aren't parking permanently in RVs in their streets. Squamish had similar issues. I wonder if you can provide any comment about that. I appreciate Councillor Bonner's suggesting we try and allow it in neighborhoods on people's property, but I'm honestly a bit concerned about opening up this box.
Yeah, if I can, through the chair, definitely we have some of the same issues, although with RVs within roadways as well, and although I don't think to the same sort of concentration or extent that some of the communities you mentioned have had, but I think I see regularly on my morning walk people getting up and moving around. They usually try to locate in different places, and they don't seem to be concentrated in our streets in any specific area. So maybe that's why we're not hearing as much complaint about it. Although I know Mr. LaBerge, his department, they do receive complaints from time to time. But we definitely do have RVs, people residing in RVs within our streets, and they tend to be mobile and try to relocate from time to time. I think it's definitely something that we'd want to approach carefully if we were looking at any expansion of RV use as accommodation on residential property. As I mentioned, there's complaints that we do respond to tend to be, obviously there's some negative implications to neighbors. At times, their residents being taken advantage of by landlords in sort of a substandard living conditions, that type of thing. We do, I think it's just important to note, I think that we do have provisions in place for appropriately serviced lands with, amenity and open space for recreational vehicle accommodation on a permanent basis. So that makes us a little bit unique, I think, from other communities, but we do have some of the similar problems, maybe just not to the same concentration and extent with folks residing in RVs in roadways and, possibly in some parks temporarily, that type of thing, or parking lots.
Thank you. Councillor Hemmons.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm less interested, I think, in allowing RVs or exploring to allow RVs in someone's driveway or in the roadway, but I am very curious in the affordable housing strategies consider approaches to allow accommodation in recreational vehicles in mobile home parks. Mr. Holm, could you comment on how we would go about that? Like, what would be the next phase? What would be the next step if we said, let's action that?
It would definitely be an involved process with, there'd definitely be consultation and consideration of impacts. I mean, mobile home parks in Nanaimo are I don't see more of those coming online, and there are implications, given the cost of land and given that generally those are they are relatively lower intensity, lower density use than some of the more permanent housing that we're seeing in our corridors and in our town centers. But I mean, considering RV use or accommodation within mobile home parks, I think there could be potential for displacement of, because I don't see a lot of capacity in our existing mobile home parks, but I could see the potential for displacement of people living in mobile homes, which are designed through the CSA standards to provide for permanent accommodation. It's a different form of housing. They're a higher standard, and they're actually designed, obviously, to be lived in permanently, and they're taxed accordingly, and they're cited, under locate permits under building code to ensure they're serviced and appropriately tethered, strapped down, and that type of thing to make sure that they're safe. And so there's as far as the process, I think we'd maybe Mr. Lindsay could jump in and add to this, but there would be an involved consultative process, and there's potential for negative implications or displacement of folks that are within mobile home parks as well. It might be worthwhile considering, and again, I'm maybe getting a little ahead of the conversation, but considering the regional district and surrounding rural lands and the capacity for accommodation of mobile home parks and recreational vehicles in surrounding areas, because we're talking about sort of high value urban lands that can, I think, be better serve and more efficiently accommodate higher density forms of housing that are more permanent in nature, and the higher value urban lands that provides for servicing and transit and all the amenities that we're striving to provide and discussing through Reimagine.
And Mr. Lindsay.
Madam Chair, could I just add on? I just wanted to be clear on Councillor Hammond's question, though, on the process specifically. It would be an amendment to your zoning bylaw. So I think Mr. Holmes correct in that, we would, anytime you would go about a change like this, we'd recommend some sort of consultation with the community and with operators, but that's really council's decision at the end of the day. It's an amendment to your bylaw, which would require legislatively one public hearing. And I just wanted to add to what Mr. Holmes saying, because I think about mobile home parks, and this might be a discussion we have to Reimagine, but there has not been a new mobile home park built in Nanaimo in probably 25 years. And the reality is now we find ourselves in a position with much of the land that we have left that's suitable for redevelopment. It typically has topographical constraints that make themselves difficult to develop mobile home parks on, or as Mr. Holmes mentioned, there's a higher value placed on those properties, and it just doesn't make the same economic sense. So we've lost that opportunity for what's really been seen historically as an affordable housing option is mobile home parks, and we always hear concern about even the loss of the ones we have existing in the community and what that would mean for residents. And I do think maybe that's a role at a more regional discussion. Is there an opportunity to look at kind of what is often thought of as a transitional or temporary housing form? Is there an opportunity that the region can play, because it's becoming increasingly difficult for the city to play that role?
Thank you. And seeing no further speakers at this time, I just wanted to add a few thoughts. First of all, from the safety perspective, having worked in the insurance industry the majority of my life, insurance companies are incredibly risk adverse, and they have no issues with insuring permanent accommodation in recreational vehicles. I think as long as people, and the majority of people, are responsible owners and have their smoke detectors and their carbon monoxide and et cetera, I'm not as concerned about safety. When I asked about this, and I had overlooked that it had been deferred to the GPC, so this was good background information. I was looking at more what came to light with Ucluelet, who was doing the temporary permit use for accommodating these. And looking to see, not in people's driveways necessary, but if you had a certain size of a property that maybe you don't have a carriage house on, but you could accommodate a family member. What I've heard from people in the public is often it's their adult children or adult or their parents who need a place, or like we saw with the retired construction worker. So I was looking to see what is already happening with some other communities, with what they're doing with temporary use permits, and what perhaps if you met a certain size of property, or we do have more rural areas still within the city of Nanaimo, what we could do to help those people who would like to follow the bylaws, who would like to do things the right way, but are seeking to help with accommodation for family members, relatives, friends, etc. So I'm wondering what we could do to have a more fulsome report, and I'll let Councillor Bonner speak.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sort of reiterating what you're saying, is that I would be looking at the possibility of, similar to what we do for carriage houses. But having seen that, I would want to see a proper foundation, proper sewer connections, just like we have already at many of these mobile home parks, where you can just drive in your RV and plug it all in, and you're good to go for weeks. So I think that would probably end up being part of the bylaw, that these are the requirements if you wish to go that route. And it would include size of lot and all these sort of things. But I looked at them as a mobile carriage house more than anything else. So I think going along that same route would be where I'd be interested in going. Thank you.
Madam Chair, you're muted. I'm not sure.
Sorry, we have no other speakers at this time.
So, Madam Chair, I was wondering if it would be appropriate, and Mr. Lindsay and Mr. Holm can jump in, if the motion that was deferred to this meeting would be appropriate to make now, and that was that Council directs staff to prepare a report on the options available to support permanent recreation vehicle accommodation. And I'm assuming in that report, it would provide the options for amending the bylaw and what steps would need to be taken and or other solutions. And perhaps Mr. Holm and Mr. Lindsay could speak to that. But I think if that's sufficient, then that motion could be made now that you've had that discussion.
Councillor Bonner?
I'm moving it.
Do I have a seconder? We do not have, seconded Councillor Hemmons.
And just for clarification, Chair, it will be that the Governance and Priorities Committee recommend that staff, just because this is the GPC committee members, not council. So just that slight difference in the motion.
Further. Thank you. Okay, I'm not seeing any speakers' hands, and it's near the end of our meeting, so I'll call the question. All those in favor? And all those opposed? Mayor Krogh and Councillor Brown and Councillor Thorpe opposed. I think I've got that, so the motion passes. So, thank you, everybody. I think we're near the end of our meeting. We do have one more item, and that's our Government and Management Excellent 2021 Council Alignment Update. And Mr. Rudolph.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, there's a couple of options for council in this piece of paper that you have in front of you. One is that you've really not sat down and had a real kind of large conversation around this, though this is a product of a fairly large, robust workshop. You could defer this to or have a conversation where you want to spend an hour or two on it, or you could just use it as a tool to receive for information and ask questions around the status of projects at any time. So the goal of this was to have this attached to GPC agendas as an ongoing piece of information, and or have a quarterly check-in with the status, and these will be updated, refreshed periodically. So if council would prefer just to receive it for information and ask questions or something like that, that's certainly possible. If you would like to do a deeper dive on this and confirm this as a set of priorities for council at the council end, and any questions around the staff work program, be pleased to do that. So it's really, of course, we are at the after 2 hours of other information this morning and another session this afternoon. I'm not sure what your preference is, but as a minimum, you could certainly, it's there as a information item, but if you would like to discuss items and confirm these are your priorities or flesh them out a little bit more, that would take a separate session, I think, and we would make sure we should put it at the beginning of the agenda process, not at the end.
There you go. Thank you. Does anybody wish to speak to this? I think we're receiving this for information today, being that we have another couple hours on a Zoom call this afternoon. So, Mayor Crow, did you want to? I don't understand what he's saying.
Chair, you said a couple hours. We're scheduled for 3 hours.
Oh, 3 hours. Okay. So, do I have a movement for adjournment? So moved by Councillor Hemmons, seconded by Councillor Bonner. All those in favor? Have a good lunch, everybody.